Benazir Bhutto, Chapter 3, Favored Daughter of East by Dear. Chapter 3. Before the 16-year-old Benazir left for America in the fall of 1969, her father had warned her that she might see things there that would shock her. And on arrival, she found that this was so. The most shocking thing of all was her fellow students' ignorance of her country. Many of them had not even heard of Pakistan, and among those who had few could place it on a map. If they were told it was next to India, that cleared up quite a bit. This was, after all, the 60s, and India was a favorite stop on the hippie trail. But the basic facts of Pakistani history and geography that it had come into being only 23 years earlier had at that time the largest Muslim population in the world and was comprised of two wings, west and east, separated by 1,000 miles of hostile India, were largely unknown even to America's best and brightest students, that Pakistan was supposed to be an important American ally against communism, and that the average American knew nothing about this and cared less, was an additional blow to the extreme national pride with which Benazir had been raised. She was also shocked, at least initially, by what she perceived as the rigors of daily life in a nominally egalitarian, non-hierarchical society. To say that she had been surrounded by servants from birth is an understatement. The family retainers of Pakistan's great feudal families led lives more reminiscent of those, not the least of what she took away from her years abroad. But even after 4 years in America, she never said her characteristic dehaunt and was arrogance, a relic of her feudal upbringings and of Russian serfs than of America or Europe servants. Before the Benazir's arrival of Radcliffe recounted her fellow student, the future writer Annie Fadiman, she had never cooked a meal, washed a blouse, walked more than a block without being picked up by a chauffeur or lifted a ringing telephone. She cried most of her first semester, like her father who was on his first night in his Los Angeles boarding house, had wondered who was going to draw his bath. Benazir was unable to perform smallest household task. She quickly learned many of these skills, of course, and was proud of the new competence that was not the least of what she took away from her years abroad. But even after 4 years in America, she never said her characteristic dehaunt and was arrogance, a relic of her feudal upbringing and the Bhutto's propensity to see themselves as royalty. 4 years later, when she was at Oxford, her Indian friend Syam Bhatia, now a well-known journalist, noted that Benazir at university epitomized the classic spoiled rich girl from a third world country. She was self-obsessed, liked to have her own way, and her temper tantrums were legendary. Bhatia went on to quote another Oxford student who had visited the family in Pakistan. When Pinky loses her temper, she throws ashtrays like flying saucers at the servants. But if these comments make Benazir sound difficult and unpopular, that was very far from being the case. Most of her new friends found her a galvanic, energizing presence, intellectually curious, humorous, passionately engaged in college life. She was funny, Ferdinand had said, very funny. She loved that she was relatively anonymous because her Harvard roommate Yolanda Kodrivicki. She was exotic, but she could blend in. She liked to hang out with people who were not very political. It was an escape. She was so much in the limelight in Pakistan. She became a campus tour guide and the social secretary of her dorm, Elliot House. She soon said her distinctly uncool salwar kameez, the traditional Pakistani garment she favored in Karachi, for jeans and t-shirt. Dating, though, was not an option for her. I think that, in a sense, she lived vicariously through her friends, says Kodriki, and was very intensely interested in her friends' love lives. Banerjee found surrogate parents in Galbraith and his wife. Their son Peter Galbraith was also at Harvard and would attend Oxford during Banerjee's time there as well. In his future career, Peter would prove perhaps Banerjee Bhutto's most important friend. The kind of ideal American connection Julfikar had sent her to Harvard to meet. It was to be Peter's intervention in 1983 that secured Banerjee's freedom after 5 years in custody. The year 1969 was a heady time to be at a great American university, perhaps the headiest time ever. The anti-war movement was in full swing, as was the sexual revolution. Banerjee was exposed to ideas, assumptions, and way of thinking that had never quite permitted even the relatively liberated milieu she inhabited in Pakistan. As a fellow Asian, she vocally sympathized with the Vietnamese and expressed resentment at American incursion into their country. She had opposed the bar even before she arrived in the United States. Once there, caught up in the momentum of the time, she marched on Washington and joined a moratorium day protest on Boston Common. The women's movement was reaching a crescendo in 1970, shortly after Banerjee's arrival in America. The seminal Sexual Politics by Kate Milletier was published and became, in Banerjee's word, the campus Bible. Yolanda Kodriki remembers that Banerjee did not swallow Millet's message whole. In fact, she was very critical of the women's movement. She had this view that women were becoming unwomanly in the women's movement. She felt that women were losing the sense of what it meant to be a woman. Student rap sessions in this period of second wave feminism centered around new models for combining work and marriage, but Banerjee was always aware that the issues she would face as a relatively liberated and secular woman in a traditional patriarchal culture were very different from those that would confront her American friends. As Kodriki noticed, she was definitely interested in attractive men, but she was probably less concerned, even then, with marriage than with a career in public life. She was eagerly planning, but she would have realized that a husband was an indispensable accompaniment in the program she had mapped out for herself. In Pakistani society, a single woman's legal rights were limited and her prestige low. If Banerjee's Harvard friends knew nothing about Pakistan when she arrived, they were soon to learn a great deal, for a tragedy was unfolding before the world's eyes, one in which Banerjee's famous father played a starring, if not a heroic, role. On December 7, 1970, Pakistan held its first general election since independence, with results that might have been predicted. The geographic division of the country was bizarre and probably would never have been workable over the long run. West Pakistan was made up of the Punjab, by far the dominant province, Sindh, Northwest Frontier Province, and Balochistan. East Pakistan, separated from the west by 1,000 miles of India, was East Bengal. West Bengal was in India. The two parts of Pakistan were distinct. Ethnic Pakistan was geographically smaller but had a slightly larger population. West Pakistan had the economic and military age. With the breakup of the Raj, it had inherited the military infrastructure. The Punjab had been the sword arm of the Raj, and the higher echelons of the army were from that part of the country. The city of Rawalpindi in West Pakistan was home to the army's general headquarters. The state bureaucracy too was overwhelmingly situated in West rather than East Pakistan. The East Pakistanis felt with some justification that the western half of the country treated their half like a colony. Each year some 3 billion rupees $300 million were transferred from East to West Pakistan and spent on consumption and capital investment in the West. When funds and resources were allocated nationally, the East inevitably got the short end of the stick. More than that, Urdu and English had been named the official languages of Pakistan, while Bengali, the language of East Pakistan, was ignored. In 1968-69, a major uprising had taken place, in which the East Pakistani Awami League, led by Sheikh Mujibur Rahman, presented a very reasonable 6-point plan demanding increased autonomy for the beleaguered East. In the 1970s elections, West Pakistan saw the Islamist Jamaat-e-Islami confront Bhutto's PPP, while in East Pakistan the Awami League emerged as the leading party. When votes were counted, it turned out that the inevitable had happened. In West Pakistan, the PPP had done best, but the Awami League had swept East Pakistan, winning 160 out of 162 seats in East Pakistan and an absolute majority in the National Assembly. According to parliamentary principles, the Awami League's Sheikh Mujibur Rahman should be the leader of Pakistan. This was most definitely not an outcome Zulfikar Ali Bhutto was prepared to accept. He refused to admit that Mujib had any right to lead all of Pakistan, contending that the majority parties of the country's two wings, the PPP and the Awami League, should share power. Mujib did not agree. Bhutto, passionately intricide, threatened to break the legs of any PPP members who took their elected places in the new National Assembly. The statement was on. The new assembly was supposed to draft a new constitution, re-stabilizing civilian government after 12 years of military rule. But the inability of Mujib and Bhutto to come to an agreement made Yahya Khan's role in the transfer of power more important. Bhutto and Mujib spent 2 inconclusive months haggling over the details of the new constitution, with Mujib threatening to demand virtual autonomy for East Pakistan if he did not get his way, and Bhutto cementing alliances with the military. Tahmina Durrani, wife of Bhutto's off-again political crony Mustafa Khar and daughter of the governor of the state bank, had claimed that Bhutto secretly tried to strong-arm her father with physical threats to withdraw state assets from East Pakistan. With growing unrest in East Pakistan, including mass protest, civil war was suddenly a frightening possibility. Then at midnight on March 25, 1971, the Pakistani military launched a campaign of brutal repulsion in East Pakistan. This revolting campaign, writes historian Anatole Lieven, was the most terrible blot on the entire record of the Pakistani army and was made possible by old and deep-seated racial contempt by the Punjabi and Pathan soldiers for the Bengalis, whom they also regarded as not true Muslims but crypto-Hindus. Operation Search Right was masterminded and led by General Tikka Khan, who earned the title of Butcher of Bengal for his ruthless cracked down not only on separatists and agitators, but also on many thousands of Bengalis who had no involvement in politics whatever. The offensive started at the University of Dhaka with a massive tank assault against students' dormitories. Students and intellectuals were targeted throughout Operation Searchlight. The army used rape systematically as an instrument of warfare. Mujibur Rahman was thrown into jail and the Awami League outlawed. In the east, separatist leaders proclaimed the independent Republic of Bangladesh. Refugees fleeing the horror in East Pakistan began pouring over the border into India at a rapid rate. By the end of the conflict, their number would total something like 10 million. The killings hit genocidal levels. With Hindus residing in East Pakistan, there were some 10 million of them bearing the brunt of the attacks. Images of the carnage in the press shocked the world, the horror compounded by the deadly tropical cyclone that had struck the Bengali coast just before the war, killing between 3 and 500,000 people. Bangladesh in 1971 was the most terrible place on earth. Zulfikar Ali Bhutto unapologetically supported the military action, laying out his views in a tract called The Great Tragedy, in which he rather surprisingly referred to Bangladeshi separatism as the nightmare of fascism. In late November, India, with its vast military machine, came into the war on the side of Bangladesh. This spelled the end for the Pakistani army, which collapsed in disarray 2 weeks later. In December 1971, Bhutto headed for New York to present the West Pakistani case before the UN Security Council, and he summoned Benazir to join him at the luxurious Pierre Hotel, his usual quarters when visiting New York. Here he got a crash course in international crisis politics when Zulfikar asked her to man the telephone in his suite. She fielded calls from Henry Kissinger as well as from the heads of the Soviet, Chinese, and American delegations to the UN. The American delegations happened to be led by George H.W. Bush. Her father instructed her, she later recounted, to interrupt the meetings for maximum effect. If the Soviets are here, tell me the Chinese are calling. If the Americans are here, tell me that Russians are on the line or the Indians. And don't tell anyone who really is here. One of the fundamental lessons of diplomacy is to create doubt. Never lay all your cards on the table. It was Benazir's first experience of the excitement of power politics. She was thrilled and galvanized. As usual, she saw only the greater as she watched her father's performance at the United Nations. But it was clear to the international cast of players assembled there that Zulfikar Ali Bhutto was 100% behind Tikka Khan's cruel offensive. Under Secretary General Brian O'Connor, who found Bhutto intelligent, arrogant, charming, and unpredictable because I called Bhutto at the Pierre Hotel and explained what had happened. He flew into a great passion and said over and over again, "The Pakistan army will fight to the last man and the last pound." I asked Bhutto if he really thought the Pierre Hotel in New York was the best place to fight to the last man and the last pound in Dhaka. He began to laugh and said that of course we must pass the instrument of surrender to the Indians. On December 9, Pakistan accepted the ceasefire. The nation of Bangladesh was born. Yahya Khan would look back bitterly on the tragedy years later. It was Bhutto, not Mujib, he reflected, who broke Pakistan. Bhutto's stance in 1971 and his stubbornness harmed Pakistan's solidarity much more than Sheikh Mujib's 6-point demand. It was his high ambitions and rigid stance that led to rebellion in East Pakistan. But at the time, this was not evident to the world, and it was certainly not evident to the bunkered Benazir, who found herself in the position of having to passionately defend her father's motives and actions to her American Friends, they were horrified by the news reports and photographs coming out of Bangladesh. Zulfikar and Nusrat sent Benazir articles from government-controlled Pakistani newspapers that claimed Western news reports were exaggerated, part of a Zionist plot in fact. In her naivete, or more probably her unwillingness to credit anyone that did not reflect well on her beloved father, she believed them and tried unsuccessfully to impart this point of view to her fellow students and even to the professors at Harvard. Annie Fadiman remembers her lecturing a professor, Michael Wazer, who had dared to criticize West Pakistani policies in a class. Several years later, she even embarked on a remarkably ill-advised attempt to persuade the faculty of Oxford to award her father an honorary degree, still not realizing the extent to which he had been tainted in the eyes of the world. In her autobiography, she would admit that she had been unforgivably ignorant at that time, but she would never place any of the blame on Zulfikar. Her retrospective comments are revealing. Instead of working with my father and the representatives of West Pakistan to write a new constitution acceptable to both wings of Pakistan, Mujib instigated an independence movement to sever East Pakistan or East Bengal from the Western Federation completely. Time and again my father appealed to Sheikh Mujib to keep Pakistan intact, to work together with him, a fellow civilian, to oust the military rule of Yahya. But instead of showing flexibility and agreeing to what was a political necessity, Mujib showed an obstinacy, the logic of which to this day defies me. With his lawyers' policy of never admitting a fault, Zulfikar blamed everyone but himself for the horrors of the war and the loss of half the country. In a bizarre television interview at Heathrow Airport in December 1971, as he returned from New York to Pakistan to claim the presidency, he asserted that the people of Pakistan had elected him as their undisputed and chosen leader a year previously, and he refused, as he always would, to accept the loss of East Pakistan as permanent. Temporary phenomena are not realities, he insisted. Realities are studied in history, and historically the concept of Pakistan, the idea of Pakistan, cannot perish like this. Fine rhetoric, but history was very thin in the case of Pakistan. The nation had only 23 years of history behind it when it broke up. Tainted, he might have been in the world's eyes, but when Zulfikar Ali Bhutto assumed the presidency of Pakistan, which now meant just West Pakistan, on December 20, 1971, he was a hero to the majority of his people. After 13 years of military rule, having a democratically elected leader was something to celebrate, and cries of G.A. Bhutto, long live Bhutto, rang through the streets. The Americans did not trust him for a moment. Since the 1940s, they had been handing over billions of dollars in military aid to Pakistan in the deluded hope that the new staunch ally against communism. Pakistan had spent the money on an arsenal hugely disproportionate to its overall budget, but the enemy its leaders had in mind was not the American bugbear, Mao's China, but another even closer neighbor, India, which they hated and feared, a fact of which American leaders had been made painfully aware both in 1965 and in 1971. Nevertheless, the Americans felt far more comfortable dealing with army officers with whom they had a mutual understanding than with populist politicians. Now here was a declared socialist as president of Pakistan in a Mao cap, no less, promising his people that they would no longer be the Americans' toadies aligning his country with the Chinese and Soviets, and proposing himself as the leader of a potentially powerful third world coalition. His charisma and popularity made the White House and the Pentagon very nervous indeed. Henry Kissinger's memoirs express This nervousness, nicey, arrogant, arrogant, subtle. Bhutto was at least a representative who would be able to compete with the Indian leaders for public attention. The legacy of distrust engendered by his flamboyant, demeanor, and occasionally cynical conduct haunted Bhutto within our government. I found him brilliant, charming, of global stature in his perceptions. At the outset of his presidency, Bhutto promised an end to the country's endemic nepotism and cronyism. I have no relations, I have no family, he declared in a major public address on inauguration day. My family is the people of Pakistan. My children are the people of Pakistan. But yet one of his first acts in office was to appoint us governor of Sindh, his cousin Mumtaz Ali Bhutto, the family patriarch and an even bigger landowner than he was. And while Zulfikar might have told the crowds that his children were the people of Pakistan, his biological children were still receiving the best possible education in preparation for high-profile careers in public service. Of the four of them, only Shah Nawaz, who did not seem to possess his siblings' academic abilities, did not attend Harvard, going instead to the American College in Ryazan, Switzerland, one of the most expensive and luxurious schools on the globe. Banerjee was slated to move on to Oxford after graduating from Harvard. She adored her father, went to Oxford to please him, because one Oxford friend, though she really loved and felt more at home in America than England. Now as the eldest child and only already at university, she was chosen to accompany her father to India, where he was to sign the Simla Accords with Indira Gandhi, putting a legal end to the Bangladesh war and negotiating the release of 93,000 Pakistani prisoners of war and the return of captured Pakistani territory. For the first time in her life, Banerjee was thrust into the spotlight, and to her surprise, she found that it showed her to distinct advantage. In news films of the period, she can be seen following her father and being introduced to the powerful people assembled at the old hill station. She is pretty, arrogant, rather demure. Her father had warned her to show no emotion, either positive or negative. Reached onlookers draw conclusions about the progress of the negotiations. Nice looking, but in no way showy. The inordinate attention she attracted is hard to explain. Crowds gathered around her in the street, cheering, following her, literally stopping traffic. She even became something of a fashion cynosel. Odd. Since in these films, she never seems to be bearing anything particularly eye-catching. The members of the Pakistani delegation were at a loss to explain the phenomenon. Banerjee herself offered a plausible reason. I symbolized a new generation. I had never been an Indian. I had been born in independent Pakistan. I was free of the complexes and prejudices which had torn Indians and Pakistanis apart in the bloody trauma of partition. Kordiaki, who saw her when she returned to Harvard, thought that the Simla experience was the big turning point, the moment Banerjee fell in love with political life. She definitely liked the attention. She definitely liked talking to the media. She was more than just an attractive girl. She had, it turned out, star quality. It was the first time she had been made aware of that fact. Zulfikar Ali Bhutto quickly set to work to enact some of the reforms he had promised during his Fevers campaign. In 1972, Pakistan's banks, insurance companies, and major industries were nationalized. Although neither Zulfikar or later Banerjee would admit it, this move did not improve Pakistan's economic plight, for it led to an alarming level of capital flight and a serious dip in investment. Ayub's land reforms were extended, with ownership ceiling of IGO acres of irrigated and 300 acres of unirrigated land. This looked good on paper, but in practice the great landowners, Zulfikar Ali Bhutto included, simply transferred legal ownership of land packages to various relatives and retainers, never while increasing true control over them. When Bhutto died, his family would inhabit 12,000 acres near Larkana. The economy stagnated throughout his tenure. A new constitution was drafted under the aegis of the royal Mian Mahmud Ali Kasuri, which replaced the current system, in which the president had nearly absolute power, with a parliamentary one on the British model, and Bhutto duly resigned as president and took office as prime minister, having no wish, however, to be put out of power as easily as prime minister were in Britain. With a simple vote of no confidence, he meddled with the laws to make that process more cumbersome. He also limited the power of judiciary and made it illegal for the government to dissolve political parties. In Pakistan, and the army, like the intelligence bureau service, is a formidable power in its own right and has always functioned quite government. Unable to control it, but to left the military high command to its own devices. One of his greatest mistakes. While outwardly pursuing his non-alignment strategy, Bhutto was still applying plenty of pressure on the United States to continue its military aid, which had slowed to a trickle in the wake of the Bangladesh war. The Americans now realized that whatever arms they supplied to Pakistan were far more likely to be used against India than against Communist China or Soviet Union. The fall of Nixon in 1974 and the change of regime in the United States after 1976, when Jimmy Carter succeeded Gerald Ford and Kissinger finally left power, were also significant, and at that time, the US Congress began introducing legislation that would restrict military aid to countries that had or were developing the nuclear bomb. Bhutto was surreptitiously but determinedly supporting work on a Pakistani bomb awaited by the metallurgist A.O.Q. Khan, who had stolen designs for a uranium enrichment facility from the Netherlands. The announcement of Indian nuclear test in May 1974 was devastating to Pakistani morale, and it was now not a question of whether Pakistan would develop a bomb but how fast it would be able to do so. As far back as 1965, Bhutto had said that if India developed a bomb, we will eat grass, even go hungry, but we will get one of our own. We have no other choice. The secret machination over nuclear intelligence would continue during Banerjee's two administrations, when she herself would reportedly play a cloak and dagger game with Pakistan's ally North Korea. Through all of this, Zulfikar continued living in his usual regal manner, even upping the ante to suit his new status as a world leader. Nina Durrani had described his spectacular dinner parties, each one a major event for Pakistan's social and cultural elite. Bhutto was expert at the finer points of cuisine, and he dictated every detail of the menu. He loved French food and was a connoisseur of fine wines and selected with great care. He personally chose the china and cutlery. He inspected the attire and procedure of the retinue of servants. He even supervised the floral arrangements. Bhutto's multifarious enemy observed his grandiosity with knowing smiles, referring to him privately as the Raja of Larkana. He lived like a Raja, and he ran the country like one too. He used the intelligence agencies to spy on political rivals. He controlled the media, making sure that his own image was always front and center, and that nothing unflattering to him appeared in print or on television. He utterly refused to share power within the PPP, and without and serious debate was crushed. Any potential rival was seen as a threat, and eventually Bhutto took to eliminating such threats by appointing relatives, cronies, and dependents to important positions within the party and in his administration. The traditional Pakistani method, and one that Benazir adopted without hesitation when she in turn came to power. Nominally, Bhutto was a socialist, but there was little genuine change in socialist Pakistan. Thank you very much for listening. This is the chapter 3 of Benazir Bhutto, page 29. Thank you.